Welcome to Go and Do. I'm your host, Ajalon Stapley, and I once almost got into a brawl fighting over the guitar pick the lead singer threw out at a Nickelback concert. There's nothing in that statement of which I am proud. It's true. True story. Thank you for being here, folks. This is Go and Do, where we talk about politics, culture, family, and faith, and how they all connect from a conservative, traditional value, faith affirming member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints perspective. And today is the big one. It is the big one. Today is the fourth and final installment of our 4-part series on how wokeism is Marxism, repackaged, recycled, and doing a pretty dang good job at taking down the West. If this is your first time, welcome. I'm going to recap the first 3 episodes, although I do suggest to fully understand the breadth of what we are talking about here to go back and watch those. Look at this photograph. If this is not your first time being here, if you have watched 1 or 2 or 3 of those first episodes, congratulations. We're on to the big one, okay? It's been a trek, and today is going to be the longest episode thus far, probably the longest one I'll ever film. But we need to go through it. I thought about breaking it up into a couple different episodes, but we're just going to push through because I want you to see how it all connects. So to recap the first 3 episodes, we have learned about Karl Marx and how Marxism was basically a worldview absent of God. That's what it is. When you boil it down to its simplest form, it is a way to look at the world and to explain everything in it without a creator. In this theory, Marx explained how the class struggle between the haves and the have-nots is central to economics and prosperity, but it's also a part of society at large in shaping morality for individuals and entire civilizations. And while this was meant to benefit the have-nots, that's who Marx was trying to help. We saw that it was mainly people who were in the haves group who latched onto this ideology. We saw how it was the upper class, educated, oftentimes very educated, secular-minded, atheistic, young, idealistic, intellectual types who took Marxism and put it into practice in the form of communism. We saw this happen in Russia, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Cuba. We saw how communists infiltrated those nations as well as other nations using propaganda, espionage, and then revolutions. We heard from several former communist whistleblowers who exposed this plan, who exposed spy rings in America, but more importantly, exposed the propaganda war that is being waged and has been waged for decades. We saw how effective propaganda can be when we looked at the indoctrination processes that took place in China and Cambodia. If you're doubting any of this that I talk about today, I encourage you to go watch episode 3 where we talked about that, because that exposes a lot of similarities to what is happening now in America. Now we get to the meat of this 4-part series, the rise of Marxism in America, how wokeism is Marxism. Yes, how progressives, liberals, Democrat, the woke, how people on the left, whether they realize it or not, and most do not realize it, are just pushing Marxist ideologies. That's what we're going to talk about today. And as a reminder, we live in a cultural Marxist society. That's the case I'm making here. Not that we look or that we live in something that looks similar to Soviet communism. The case that I am making is that we are living in the aftermath of this cultural revolution, this Marxist push in the culture, starting in the 60s, that has changed the fabric of our nation. It has changed the way that we Americans view America, view each other, view our government, and it has resulted in what we're seeing today. We're going to divide this into three sections. The first section is the growth of the federal government and the abandonment of the Constitution. The second section is how Marxist theories evolved and came to America, specifically American universities, where they continue to evolve, igniting movements and revolutions, and just piggybacking on other movements and revolutions. And third, we're going to be going through these Marxist theories, and they are Marxist theories. Ready? Black liberation theory, critical race theory, DEI, second wave feminism, sexual theory, sexual revolution, gender theory, and queer theory. We're going to go through all of those because I want you to see the ties. I want you to understand the thread of those theories that are in practice right now in our culture and how it goes back to Marxism. So, some things to think about as we go through this. Just keep asking yourself, okay, how did we get to 2025? When I'm talking about these things, think about how it relates to today, because we're going to start at the turn of the 20th century. But I want you to think about, okay, how did that lead us to now? I want you to look at the levels of devotion to these ideals, which are things that we thought about in the previous episodes, right? This isn't just a hobby or an interest. It is a very, very deeply embedded belief system that people have that persuades their thoughts, their actions, their words, their voting habits. It is a religion. And they will laugh at you. I've said this before, and people laugh because most of the time they don't even believe in religion. They don't believe in God because they think that they're smarter than that. They're above that, right? And they say, no, this isn't a religion, right? You're just some simple-minded Christian. But when you look at the devotion that they have, I'm a very devoted member of the Christian faith, and those beliefs shape my identity. It shapes everything about who I am, what I do, the words I say, how I think, how I vote. And people are entitled and have every right to believe and behave and vote the way they want to believe and behave and vote. But this is what shapes them. You look at young people today, especially at universities and colleges, they are very devoted to this. And it is not anything new. This has been the case since the inception of Marxism, back at Karl Marx. But we're going to look at, like I said, the turn of the century to modern day. So think about the devotion that these people have to their belief system. Also, how these ideals have evolved and repackaged themselves, and how you see that being played out in modern time. Now, how did Marxism take hold on the country? Well, we have to go back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And we're going to look at a group of people who were not Marxists or communists. I want to be very clear about that. They are not Marxists, not communists, but they were progressives. This is called the progressive era. And in the other episodes, I had you focus on a particular scripture in the Book of Mormon. Remember, it was 2 Nephi 9:29. To be learned is good as long as they hearken to the counsels of God. And we looked at how many past and present who are learned or educated sadly start to use that information, that knowledge, to not believe in God. And in doing so, they start to see themselves as God. So to be learned is good as long as we hearken to the counsels of God. So that was the scripture of the previous episodes. I want to add another scripture to this episode. And this is also in Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, verse 39. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men. And when he says men, the Lord is referring to mankind, okay? The human race, men and women. So don't think this does not apply to women. of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. I'm going to read that again. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. I love this verse because it's almost like the Lord is just giving a little jab to us humans, right? It's human nature. As soon as we have some sort of power or we're in charge in some respects, whether we're the leader of our study group, the captain of our team, or we're the shift manager at our McDonald's job, we will start to let that go to our head. It's just human nature. Not that it's a good thing, but it's something that happens. And the Lord is reminding us that, hey, you're great, but you're not that great. Okay. You're special. I love you, but you're not more special. And I don't love you more than other people. The Lord, have all authority. I, the Lord, have all power. Okay. I have created worlds without numbers, as numberless as the sands of the sea. The earth itself is my footstool. So just remember, kids. Now, the founders, the framers of our Constitution, of our nation, knew this. Okay. They understood this. They studied the histories of the world, they studied human behavior, and they knew from firsthand experience, just coming out of this horrible, long war with Britain, what too much power does to a person, what too much authority does to a small group or person in charge of a nation. And so they fought and they debated with one another over how to set up our country, over how large to make a central government, if any central government at all. If you're not familiar, the Constitution didn't come about as soon as the Revolutionary War ended. There was actually something called the Articles of Confederation, which just kept those 13 colonies, now states, loosely connected as independent sovereign bodies. And it didn't go very well. So they came back to the table, Congress came back to the table, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And they were split between two groups. One was, we need a stronger central government. And the other one said, no, we don't want a stronger central government because look at what we just came from. We don't want to see that repeated. And both sides had great points. Both sides were correct in a lot of their arguments. And it was a very hotly debated issue not to have too strong of a central government, which is why the Constitution ended up being this beautiful marriage compromise between the two, because you had a stronger central government laid out in the Constitution, and then you had the other group insist that you had a Bill of Rights enshrined in there, enshrining that the individual has rights, has authority over themselves. It's not, their rights are not given to them by some external authority, some king, some monarch. It is given to them by God. So the founders knew this, and they worked very hard to create a smaller central government with checks and balances and the Bill of Rights. And as much as they studied and debated to get to that conclusion of the Constitution, fast forward some time, and we have a whole new group of people who basically thought they knew better than the framers, that they knew better than the Constitution. Are you starting to see that pride go to people's heads? So the progressive era began as an intellectual rebellion against the political philosophy of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism, as in the ideas that our founding was based upon, which is the authority of the government depends on observing limitations on its powers. Okay? Small, limited government. We needed one. We learned from the Articles of Confederation that too little centralized government did not work out. They had separate navies, they had different currencies between some of the different states. It was not pretty, okay? But what the founders decided on was that it should be limited powers. However, the progressives believed that the federal government could and should be harnessed to improve individual lives and to transform society. As famed economist Thomas Sowell summarizes the progressive era, it was well intentioned and uninformed. Does that describe you? Does that describe someone you know? Because that pretty much sums up half the voters here in America. Well intentioned, bleeding heart, big, big, big bleeding heart that just wants there to be no pain, no suffering, everything to be sunshine, unicorns, and rainbows. And I know it sounds like I'm mocking you because I am, but I do get it. I do get that we look at our fellow man and we see suffering and we don't want them to suffer. Okay, that's fine. Okay, I don't think it's a very grown-up approach to life, but that is understandable, right? Good intentions as in I want to help, but uninformed as in I don't understand the role of government, the founding of this nation, what they had come from, why they laid it out the way they laid it out, why our government has checks and balances, what is their role? What is the purpose of government? And why did they frame it that way? Why did they design a government that isn't supposed to be taking care of every need of the citizens, that isn't supposed to be intervening with tax dollars, other people's money to help other people over here? And I say air quote help because another part of this uninformed piece is looking back at evidence to see if it actually has helped. Has it worked? Has all of this government intervention, all of this harnessing of the federal government to improve individuals and societies, has it actually helped? And what we're going to learn today is the answer to that is no. If you've watched the last 3 episodes of this 4-part series on Marxism, just hearing that statement, how progressives believe the federal government could be harnessed, or the power of the federal government could be harnessed to help individuals and transform society, that should get some bells going off in your head, because you start to see some similarities between Marxists and progressives. But I just want to be clear, again, that these were not Marxists. They were not communists. They were, namely, President Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Again, not communists, not Marxists, but they did expand the role of the federal government, and in doing so, reduce the role of the Constitution. And as you grow the size of the government, you naturally shrink the size of the citizen, or you shrink the freedoms the citizen has. Theodore Roosevelt. He's a beloved historical figure, so much so that they named the teddy bear after him.
Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of these United States of America, at your service.
But facts are facts. He was president from 1901 to 1909 as a Republican. He lost the primary in 1912 and then led a split from the Republican Party to form the Progressive Party. This was in the middle of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is from 1890 to 1920. That's the official end date, but there's evidence that progressives didn't go away. But that's the time frame we're talking about. In addition to believing the federal government could be used to transform society for the better, they also blamed big businesses for societal ills. Like other progressives, Teddy Roosevelt was a critic of big business. He was known for painting big business as the bad guy, labeling them robber barons. As Thomas Sowell points out in a quite scathing article, I'll include it in the links below, Roosevelt's critique was ironic because, quote, it was not inhibited by any knowledge of economics and his own business ventures lost money. As in, Teddy Roosevelt and other progressives were quick to stir up hysteria over the rise of these new businessmen like Henry Ford and John Rockefeller. But these critics had no experience or knowledge of what they were critiquing. They were uninformed. What was the answer progressives were pushing to this? Well, an income tax to siphon off some of that wealth from the rich, who they had so conveniently vilified, despite their lack of knowledge or experience in the world of business, but they vilified them. And then their answer was to take the money, because then you can use that money to help transform society, which is all that you want to do. You just want to make the world a better place. Unfortunately for them, the Constitution forbade that. So their next idea was to change the Constitution. And they did that. A few years later, in 1913, the 16th Amendment was passed that granted Congress the power to impose and collect an income tax, which has increased over the years. Another trait of the progressive era was a critique that the Constitution was hard to amend, which was the point. That's what the founders wanted. Roosevelt described the judicial branch as purely negative activity in forbidding the state to exercise power. That's the whole point. The whole point of the judicial branch is to make sure that the state doesn't exercise too much power or exercise power that is contrary to what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights have laid out. Roosevelt wanted to expand presidential powers while limiting judicial power, so growing the federal government while limiting the Constitution. That hurt my heart when I heard that too, because we love Teddy Roosevelt. He was just Teddy Roosevelt. He's a teddy bear. Oh, but like I said, facts are facts. That takes us to Woodrow Wilson, who, in my opinion, embodies the progressive era and progressives in general. Why? Well, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. He was an intellectual. He had a career in academia before becoming president. He held a PhD, two actually, in history and government, was and still is the only president to have a PhD. He taught political science at Princeton, went on to become the president at Princeton, then was governor of New Jersey, then president of the United States. So he's very unique in his background before becoming president. And what Woodrow Wilson is known for is his disdain for the Constitution, as well as introducing experts.
I know more than you know.
Woodrow Wilson attacked the Constitution in his writings as an academic before he became president, openly claiming that the Constitution was outdated and that the courts should erode the limits that the Constitution places on the federal government. That the courts should erode or get rid of the limits that the Constitution puts on the federal government. Why? Well, remember, progressives believe that the federal government should be used to help humanity, that is their role, as opposed to the actual role that the founders laid out, which is to protect our natural rights, those rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights. That's the role of government. But progressives, and to their credit, okay, there was suffering and they wanted to help. And they thought, why not use this institution, this entity of the federal government and all their tax dollars and all the power that they could have to make things better? Why is that bad? Does that sound bad? Well, that's what people are pushing today. And a lot of people agree with it and believe it. Why is that bad, you ask? Well, let's remember what the Lord told us in D&C 121. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. In 1891, Wilson wrote, quote, "The functions of government are in a very real sense independent of legislation and even constitutions." Wilson's policies set up a new era in America where we see the rise of what has been called the secret fourth branch. Now, I just heard about this not too long ago. I had heard it described as the administrative state or bureaucrats or bureaucracies, but I do like this description because I think it accurately describes what is going on. And this was based on Wilson's concept to grow the federal government and also that the government should be run by administrative experts. And that these experts would comprise agencies. These agencies would fall under the executive branch, under the president's role, and then improve humanity and make it better. Okay, so here's the problem with that. One of the problems. These agencies exercise a combination of executive, legislative, and even judicial powers without a separation of functions. So our government is set up with the three branches of government with very distinct roles. You have the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, and they are the ones who make the laws. And then you have the executive branch, they enforce the laws. And then you have the judicial branch, which interprets the laws and makes sure that they are in line with the Constitution. So, how does the secret fourth branch, the administrative state, exercise all of these powers? Well, the legislature makes the laws and then they hand it over to the executive branch and it goes to these agencies, these administrators, these experts, these bureaucrats, and they are in charge of executing the law, but also they are allowed to interpret the ambiguities within the law. So they technically don't write the law or make the law, but they get to decide what the law means. They interpret it and then they execute it. And then if someone is not happy with that law, right, what do you do? You go to the courts and you sue. So if someone goes to the courts and they say, hey, this law isn't fair, thanks to a ruling back in 1984, the court is required to uphold the agency's interpretation of the law as long as it's reasonable. The courts won't rule on the law. They will instead defer back to the experts, to the federal agency. Yes, the agency that interpreted the law and is enforcing it in a way that you don't think is fair. Okay, so legislature makes the law, sends it to the executive branch. Executive branch decides how to best execute it because they are the experts. And there is some wisdom in this, but you see where it starts to go wrong because they start to enforce it. Someone else says, hey, that's not fair. I don't like that. They go to the courts, and instead of the court being an impartial third party to decide who's right, they instead say, we don't know enough about this. These guys do. The executive, these guys do. The agency knows, so we're going to defer to the agency. This is called the Chevron doctrine. It was thankfully just struck down by the Supreme Court last year, cutting back on some of the power the federal agencies has. And that's a good thing. I'm going to read to you a real life example of this. This is from Pacific Legal Foundation. Commercial fishing is a tough business with little margin for error. Each day can be a struggle to catch a profitable haul. A 2007 law allows the National Marine Fisheries Service, so this is a federal agency, to put federal observers or monitors on board commercial fishing vessels to watch fishermen and make sure they're following regulations. For fishermen, that's a tough enough pill to swallow. Most commercial fishing boats are small and can only fit a limited number of people. Bringing a federal monitor on board often means leaving one of your regular crew behind. Here's the kicker. The National Marine Fisheries Service was experiencing budget shortfalls and couldn't pay for all the monitoring it wanted to do. So it decided to make the fishermen pay the $700 a day salaries of monitors watching them. The law doesn't say fishermen should foot the bill. That's just the agency's interpretation of the law. But when a fishing company sued the government, a district court and a court of appeals in DC cited Chevron and deferred to the agency. And so, as Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch puts it, under Chevron, rather than say what the law is, courts tell those who come before the court to go ask a bureaucrat. This is what Wilson started. Okay, he also expanded the executive branch with the creation of the Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, and the IRS. So you can thank him come April time. He also grew the federal government and filled it with experts, with bureaucrats. You've probably heard about DOGE. This is the new federal agency headed up by Elon Musk. And I got to tell you, it is really, really sad and speaks to the straight up just indoctrination that has taken place in our country when you see such a level of defense of the federal government. People don't understand all the things that we've been talking about. They don't, because if they did, they wouldn't be fighting and protesting for DOGE to go away. Why? Because DOGE is cutting the federal government, and they see that as a radical, radical thing. Now, it's interesting and ironic because the argument being made against Musk and DOGE is that Musk is an unelected person who now has access to information and has authority within the government. I've heard Elizabeth Warren, right? She goes on and on and on in this just her horrible voice. Elon Musk is not elected. No one elected Elon Musk.
Not one Democrat in America voted for Elon Musk. Not one libertarian in America voted for Elon Musk. Damn, not one vegetarian in America voted for Elon Musk.
But in doing this argument that they have against DOGE is actually making the case for DOGE. All this rage about Musk because he's not elected, right? No one elected Musk. No one elected his team of, young geniuses. But where's this energy and frustration with the federal agencies that are just full of people who were not elected? Nameless, faceless bureaucrats who have no term limits, who are doing things that the American people don't know. I guarantee you, Elizabeth Warren doesn't know what they're doing, right? But no one cares. No one cares about that. But they care about this agency, which has been put under a microscope, okay? Musk has given several interviews. DOGE has an X page on X. It has a website. I've seen Musk and his team in at least one interview. Okay, they're being tracked very heavily by the media, but where's the media in tracking the thousands upon thousands of other unelected people in government who affect our lives every single day? Just to give you an example of the attention given to this agency and the people that work in this agency, the unelected workers in DOGE. This is from May 14th. It's the New York Times. The New York Times identified more than 70 people within the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, a group formed by Elon Musk that has radically upended federal agencies. Few members have formal Washington experience. Many are software engineers. All seem to have a clear mandate: shrink and disrupt the federal government. That is the mandate because that is what the Constitution called for. A small federal government. Now, this takes us to the granddaddy of growing the federal government, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was president from 1933 until his death in 1944. Term limits were created after he died. He is known for the Great New Deal and helping America fight back from the Great Depression. This is what we were taught in school, that FDR saved the country. It's not entirely true. It's not. It's sad, I know, but It's not entirely true. This is a quote from FDR's Secretary of Treasury and apparently one of his closest advisors. He said, quote, "We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. After 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot." Okay. In actuality, the government overhaul made the effects of the stock market crash worse. Okay. So what happened? Well, the stock market crashed in 1929 under Republican President Herbert Hoover. And to be fair, FDR did not start this. Herbert Hoover did. Hoover parted ways with fellow Republicans who believed there was nothing for the government to do but wait for the next phase of the business cycle and for the crash to run its course, which sounds very counterintuitive today to us because what do we see? If there's a problem, most people think the government should fix it. The government should intervene, whether that's local, state, or national government. If there's an issue, government needs to take care of it. Okay. That's not always how it's been. It's not how it should be. And Hoover parted ways with his fellow Republicans instead of just waiting for this, the business cycle. It ebbs and flows. But instead of waiting for that, he decided to intervene. He called for the federal government to conduct some bank reform and to impose tariffs. He wanted to help. He had good intentions, like we saw Thomas Sowell describe, but he was uninformed. Within 6 months after this government intervention, unemployment shot up into double digits. And this is when FDR then ran for president. The economy was in crisis. FDR pledged that a new deal for the American people. That was what he ran on. Roosevelt was overwhelmingly voted into the presidency. So by the time Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, most banks had shut down. The industrial production had decreased quite a bit, and there were 13 million workers unemployed. The New Deal included new constraints on the business or on the banking industry. It established several federal aid programs, expanded the powers of the federal government, and created government regulatory agencies. However, 2 years later, the country had still not recovered from the crisis. So what was the solution? Naturally, a second New Deal. In 1935, this included unemployment and disability insurance and pensions, federal work programs to provide temporary jobs, right? So building of Hoover Dam and things like that. Started Social Security, established minimum wage, fixed prices, introduced the idea of deficit spending, which is when the government spends money that it doesn't have.
Probably not a good idea.
Even nationalized the gold industry, something Joseph Stalin had done. Just so many things. So many things in this New Deal. The Supreme Court actually invalidated a lot of FDR's New Deal measures, saying it was unconstitutional. His response? What do you think that this progressive's response would have been? It was to propose more reform to the judicial branch and to add justices to the court so things can go in your favor. It didn't pass, but that was his solution, right? Just more federal power. I want to take a moment to just emphasize how government help really does not help. I've talked about Thomas Sowell before. If you have not heard about him, watched any of his stuff, read any of his work, I highly, highly suggest it. He started off as a very angry Marxist, and then by the time he was 30, had changed his tune to becoming conservative, spent 60 years researching economics and the effects of government and culture, not just in America, but around the globe. He said,
one summer in the government was enough to let me say, no, this government is really not the answer.
Those are not the words of someone who is biased. Those are not the words of someone who has an agenda or who just wants to push his ideology or his party forward. It is the words, they are the words of someone who has spent decades researching the effects. And his books are just textbooks. They are just laid out with statistic after statistic, example after example of how government really is not the answer. He went on to say, quote, the things that they thought were going to help didn't help, and in fact made things much worse. So when it came to the stock market crash, that's a great example of how government intervention didn't help. It actually made it worse. But Sowell is not the only one who believes this. In the 1990s, a book called Out of Work was released. This is the explanation of that book. Unemployment is used to justify every bigger government programs, from national industrial policies to high military expenditures to a return to New Deal type make work projects. This book relentlessly amasses devastating evidence that the major cause of high unemployment is government itself. The author boldly challenges that such policies as minimum wage, labor controls, unemployment compensation, and welfare have played significant roles in generating joblessness, showing that the policies of both President Hoover and President Roosevelt prolonged and exacerbated unemployment during the Great Depression. I forgot to mention the authors of this book is Richard K. Vedder and Lowell E. Galloway. So what are they talking about exactly? I'll show you what they're talking about. Here is a table from that book. This shows the estimated, if you're just listening to this, this shows the estimated monthly unemployment rates, November 1929, December 1939. Okay. I have added the color to this chart because I'm so techie. So the stock market crashed where that red dot is, October 1929. Next month, unemployment was 5%. The next month, December, it was 9%. Okay, that's scary. That's a terrifying thing. But you'll notice the following month it starts to drop. 8.3, 7.6, down to 6.8, and then June, right here, this yellow circle, June of 1930, it's 6.3%. This is when Herbert Hoover first implemented government intervention. You'll see that the unemployment rate was 6.8, 6.3. It was going down, and then it jumped up immediately after the government intervention. In July, it was 7.8. And then it goes down a little bit, 6.4, 7.0. And by November of 1930, 6 months after government intervention was introduced, or 5 months, it was 11.6. It was double digits. FDR was inaugurated March of 1933. By then, the unemployment was 28.3%, which is horrible, but you'll notice it doesn't change. It doesn't decrease with his interventions. It stays in the double digits all the way to 1939. Okay, it decreases ever so slowly, but that's 1933 to 1939, and it is still double digits. Here's another graph that shows unemployment rates from 1930 to 1945, which is when he died. So Roosevelt's presidency started right there at the height, and you see, it's decreasing, but not very quickly and not by much. Today, Roosevelt is criticized really only by the right. I haven't heard anyone on the left criticize him. So it wasn't just Sowell or the authors of this book. An economic study was done in 2004 that concluded that the New Deal policies prolonged the Great Depression. They claim that the government planning of the economy was both unnecessary and counterproductive, and that laissez-faire policies would have ended the suffering much sooner, as in the Republican ideas that Hoover parted ways from, and then FDR just took it and ran with it. So before we get to the actual communism in America, I want to recap the growth of the federal government. So who proposed this? Well, it was the brainchild of the elite, of intellectuals. There was good intention to help fix wrongs, but you start to see, especially with Woodrow Wilson, ego. You start to see pride. You start to see that he and his colleagues knew better. They knew better than the founders. They knew better than the Constitution. They knew what was best, not just for America, but Americans. And you see this pattern repeat over and over again in this attitude of, I know better. This has been an attitude on the left with progressives, with now down to just your average lefty college student, where the government, the experts know we should rely and place our trust solely in them, help individuals and transform society. This mentality that government can be the savior. Government can be God, your provider, and providing in your needs. And government can also save you. But we've been warned, friends. We've been warned. The Lord warned us in D&C 121. Oh, and this is the reason the founders laid out a government with a small central government, small with limited powers. And the bulk of the power was supposed to go to the states so that the citizens of those states could govern how they see fit. Now we get into how Marxism came to America. So the Communist Party was formed in America first in 1919. By 1939, which was during FDR's second term, both socialism and communist parties were growing to about 100,000 in membership total. These were left-wing parties who supported FDR, even though, to his credit, FDR publicly denounced communism. Okay, so not a communist, not a Marxist, but he was a politician. He was a very smart, strategic politician who effectively just co-opted all those groups on the left to kind of bring them over to the mainstream Democrat Party. So instead of taking the party over here to the kind of extreme far left, he just incorporated some of their policies and some of their rhetoric into his own. And by doing so, just kind of brought them over to the more mainstream Democrat Party. But that's not really how Marxism came to America and started to really take root in American culture. As you recall, I'm not making the case that we are living in a communistic society or that communism has taken over our politics or our institutions per se. I'm making the case that our culture and consequently our policies have been infused by neo-Marxist theories. And neo just means new or modified or revived. So to learn about this, we have to go back over to Europe, to Germany.
Augustus Gloop, the pride of Dusselheim, the fame of Western Germany, an example for the whole world.
To what was called the Frankfurt School. If you are up to speed on your conservative politics, you have heard of the Frankfurt School. This was an institute of social research at the University of Frankfurt, dubbed the Frankfurt School. Started in 1923, right after World War I ended. Now, Europe as a whole, but especially Germany, was picking up the pieces after this massive world war. And a group of people came together to ask questions and find answers to the suffering that they had been seeing, to the destruction that they saw happen in their world. Okay, that's fine. That's okay. But that's not a bad thing at all. These people were intellectuals,
just a bit outside.
academics, political revolutionists, and they were dissatisfied with the socioeconomic systems in their world. So this was the 1920s and 1930s. So they were dissatisfied with capitalism, fascism, and communism. Now, when I say they were dissatisfied with communism, it's not because they didn't like communism or because they thought communism was bad. They did like communism. They wanted it to succeed. They were frustrated because it hadn't succeeded, it hadn't taken root, and they wanted to figure out why. The Frankfurt School was comprised of devoted Marxists. Devoted Marxists. They were disappointed that communism hadn't taken root and that the public didn't catch on. The public didn't seem to understand it, that they didn't want to accept it. So this school was founded on the premise to solve this problem, to figure out why the people hadn't grasped, why the people of Europe hadn't grasped onto Marxism like they had hoped. And they believed basically it was because of cultural manipulation or brainwashing. They thought that the common man was brainwashed by culture, and that's why. That's why they hadn't grabbed hold of this ideology. So these people were Marxists. But instead of focusing and analyzing society through a purely economic perspective, just like Marx had done, right? We learned about that in episode 2, where you had two groups. You had the group that owns the stuff to make the stuff and the group that uses the stuff to make the stuff. You have the owners of the means of production and you have those who use the means of production. You have the capitalist and you have the laborers. You have the you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You have the haves and the have-nots, okay? So Marx focused on economics, and what these guys in the Frankfurt School did was to take Marx's teachings and apply them to culture. They were not economists like Karl Marx was. They hadn't studied that. They were social scientists. They were psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, musicologists, a literary critic, writers. They studied the influence of media and culture on the public consciousness. So you can think of them like social engineers. Okay, so that's what the Frankfurt School was. So what the Frankfurt School tried to do was blend the theories of Karl Marx with the very famous theories of another man who you've probably heard of before, Sigmund Freud.
Well, Eva, we've done some excellent work here.
Now, Sigmund Freud was not a Marxist. He was not a member of this school, but he was kind of a weirdo, just saying. He developed something called psychoanalysis, which is used today by a lot of people in the psychology world. He was a very strong atheist and very focused on the body and sexuality to explain human behavior and disorders. He thought that sexuality was something that human beings had from infancy, and it played a key role in our development. I believe perversion is something we're born with, that sexual repression contributes to mental disorders. Okay, so sexuality is something we have from birth, and the repression of those sexual urges leads to disorders. He thought of the Oedipus complex. I'll let you look that up on your own. Interesting fact, he treated Princess Alice, who was associated with the royal family of England. and thought that X-raying her ovaries would kill her sex drive because he thought that is what was causing her disorders. So just a lot of focus on the body and sex from Sigmund Freud, which will make sense when you see the fruits of the Frankfurt School put into action in the 1960s. Another person whose work influenced the Frankfurt School was a man named Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci was a Marxist. He was a communist. He founded the Communist Party in Italy in 1921 and is regarded as one of the most influential Marxist thinker of the 20th century. His focus was on culture. Gramsci argued that in order for communism to be accepted in the West, it couldn't be done with this overt frontal attack. He wrote that these established governments and institutions in the West would resist, which they did. He called for a different approach. It was called a war of position. It was a call for socialists and communists to subvert culture from the inside out, to take over the West from the inside out, to subvert Western culture in an attempt to compel it to redefine itself. Does this make sense? I hope it's making sense. This supports what we talked about at the end of episode 3. If you recall, I read a list from Cleon Skousen's book, The Naked Communists, where he compiled a lengthy list of goals that the communists had. And this was in the 50s, right? This was the 40s and 50s that Skousen had seen this in action, and he compiled this long list of goals, and a big part of it was culture and propaganda. And then, if you'll recall, at the end of episode 4, we talked about Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, when he spoke about the ideological subversion plan that the Soviets had for the West, for America. It all starts to come together. You start to see, remember how devoted they are to pushing their ideology and spreading it to the world. And at this time in history, they saw that, Russia was falling apart and Europe wasn't latching onto this like they had hoped. So they had to regroup. So Antonio Gramsci regrouped. The Frankfurt School regrouped, and they came out with a new method, a new approach. But that's always been the goal, is to spread communism, to take over other nations. That's always been the goal. Gramsci inspired the phrase, the long march through the institutions. You may have heard that before. That was his teachings and writings that inspired that phrase. So Gramsci saw in his homeland of Italy that in terms of economics, they were ready for this Marxist revolution, right? Because that's what Marxism is, right? It's pushing a revolution to overthrow the government, to bring forth socialism. That's what Marxism is. You need a revolution. You don't just wait for it to happen naturally. You push the revolution forward, change the government, and then you have this communal society that just is sunshines, unicorns, and rainbows.
Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows. Pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows.
So Gramsci saw that Italy was ready, or should have been ready, when it came to economics, but he said that they weren't ready mentally and culturally, that they clung to religion and tradition and did not push for this revolution that he thought they should have. He wanted to know why. Why had his country not been ready for revolution? And this is what he discovered. He wrote, quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Back to Germany.
This is how we say goodbye in Germany, Dr. Jones.
So, taking these teachings from Gramsci, from Marx, and from Sex Boy over here, Sigmund Freud, the Frankfurt School developed and taught that it was film and books and radio and music that acted as the opium of the masses. You recall in episode 2, we talked about Karl Marx, who thought that religion was the opium to the masses, that it was a distraction. It kept people kind of blissfully unaware of their surroundings, of their oppression. It kept them from awakening to their victimhood. The Frankfurt School thought this about culture. They thought culture made people happier and therefore were less likely to start a revolution and join in the communist cause, which is true.
Happy people just don't shoot their husbands.
So how do you fight this? Well, according to the Frankfurt School, not with confusing jargon and economists and things like that, but rather with cultural critics like them. Qualified experts who could show you how something seemingly benign and harmless is actually tools of capitalistic exploitation. For example, Valentine's Day. It's not a day to show loved ones you care. No. It is the commodification of love to make the capitalist wealthy. Housewives in the 1940s and 50s, well, they didn't stay home. They weren't encouraged to stay home because it was better for kids, better for families. No. They were encouraged to stay home so they would be more compelled to buy things for their home. Things that made the capitalist scum wealthy and brainwashed the housewives. One of the members of the Frankfurt School, the founder actually, believed that jazz was a tool of capitalism. Now you might be thinking, what? How does one jump through hoops to get to that point? Well, this is an explanation. He believed that the repetitive structures and predictable harmonies of jazz encouraged passive listening and discouraged critical thinking, which led to people being used and oppressed by capitalism. Okay. Are you starting to see some similarities? So the Frankfurt School used basic Marxist concepts to analyze culture and social relationships within a capitalist system. This approach became known as critical theory. Yes, that critical theory. Strands of critical theory have emerged and evolved into different things that we're going to get into later on this episode, like critical race theory, queer theory, decolonial theory. We're not going to get into that today, but all of these things, all of these theories stem from this Marxist approach, Marxist lens when looking at society. But the original critical theory was focused as a critique of capitalism and capitalistic societies and how individuals living in those societies are, say it with me now, ready? Oppressed. And not just oppressed, but they have not realized that they are oppressed. They have not awoken to their victimhood. It started here. It started here in the Frankfurt School. They provided the template for the 60s, for the counterculture, for the revolutions, the activism that came out of that time period, and has not stopped today. This is where it came from. Okay, how you may ask, how did it get from Germany to America? Well, I'm going to tell you. After Hitler ascended to power in 1933, 9 years after the school's founding, the members were forced to leave. Because if you'll recall from episode 4, we talked about how the Nazis, the fascists, and the communists were enemies. So they fled Germany. Many found refuge in the United States. Yes, folks, these Marxist social engineers, with the goal to analyze and influence culture and to eventually bring about the downfall of the West and America, to bring it ready for socialism. Where did they find refuge? The American University. The Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research, which was its actual name, was remade at Columbia University until 1949 when they moved it back to Frankfurt. So these Marxist social engineers came to America ready to implement their theories, and they did. What we see at this time period is a birth of what is called the New Left. This new creation that really came out of the universities. It was focused on activism and revolution and a whole lot of other things, basically counterculture, anti-Western teachings that we're going to get into here. And the primary driving force behind this new left movement was this neo-Marxist ideas that came through the universities to these students, latched onto other movements, and then kind of just created this mass movement that is described as the New Left. For today's purposes, we're going to just refer to it as cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism, okay? But if you learn in your classes or history books, the New Left came about during this time period. So the man considered the father of the New Left is, guess what? A Marxist. Oh, Herbert Marcuse was a member of the Frankfurt School, came to America in 1934, became a naturalized U.S. citizen 6 years later. He served as an intelligence analyst. He worked for the CIA. Okay, so he came to America 6 years later. He was a naturalized citizen, and then he worked in the government in what was the precursor for the CIA from 1941 to 1944. And then he headed up the Central European section of the Office of Intelligence Research. That's a really long title. It's a department. It's a State Department within the intelligence agency. But big picture here, remember last episode when we talked about Whittaker Chambers and the espionage going on in the government, the actual communist members who were found to have been spying on Americans and sending classified information and documents over to the Soviets. Well, I don't know what Herbert Marcuse did. I don't know, but it is interesting that he worked for the government for a few years. And then after working in the government, he taught at American universities for the next 25. He had a tremendous influence on the American political landscape. He taught at Columbia and Harvard, mostly a few other universities, but mostly Columbia and Harvard. He was extremely popular among college students. I want to talk about just three of his teachings, because you can see the effects of these still today. So one of the first things that he taught and influenced was that the Judeo-Christian culture that founded America was repressive. It repressed sexual urges, okay? And that true liberation required freeing society from those restraints. So These ideas led to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. It helped to fuel the notion, make love, not war. If it feels good, do it. That we're all just basically dogs in heat. That is what this led to. That is what he taught. And we're going to get to the sexual revolution here in a little bit, but that was him. That was something that he taught. The second idea that he taught, when I was writing this, I kind of glanced over it and was like, oh, okay, oh, yeah. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how important it is to understand this, because we are definitely seeing this today. He laid the groundwork for repression of opposing speech, or basically just contempt of free speech in general. Remember when I explained that a lot of left-wing writings kind of sound like word vomit, right? Like when I read the Communist Manifesto, that's what it sounded like. And as I studied this over the years, I've come to realize that it is quite characteristic. This is another example of one of those word vomits. And I could paraphrase it for you and make it just real simple and easy to understand, but I want you to hear how these people speak, because it's how they speak today. It's how the intelligentsia crowd speaks today. It's how politicians speak today. It's how, if you're looking at these online debates with these college students, these grad students, this is kind of how they speak as well. And it makes sense to them. And there is a point beneath all the insanity. And you have to really dig to hear what they're trying to say. So this is what he wrote in 1965. The conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and the extension of tolerance to politics, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. I'll read it again, okay? The conclusion reached is that the realization of the objective of tolerance, right? If we're trying to reach tolerance in our society, that's what he's saying, would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, and opinions, and the extension of tolerance towards policies, attitudes, and opinions that are outlawed or suppressed. Are you seeing that? So in order to achieve a society of tolerance, we have to actually be intolerant to all the things that are normal, all the things that are acceptable, all the things that traditionally, historically have been the way of life, the culture. And then we are just tolerant of everything that is not. It's very black and white. And this makes sense if you have noticed that the left has claimed for decades to be the party of tolerance. However, if you have half a brain, you would have seen by now that they're not the party of tolerance, right? They're not the party of tolerance if you disagree with them. They're definitely not the party of tolerance when you leave, right? I've seen several politicians, and so there's a whole movement called the walkaway movement, okay, about people who left the Democrat Party. And sadly, most of them, when they share these testimonials about leaving the Democrat Party and why, how they are met with such rage and disdain from friends, family members, people of the party that they once loved and worked for and voted for and were just pledged their life to. This is why. This is why if you are white, right, they can be as intolerant to you as can be, and it's okay. It's okay to be anti-white, because white, according to them, has been the mainstream, has been accepted, and in order to reach actual tolerance, we need to be intolerant to whites, or to males, or to people who are heterosexual, or to people who are Christian. Whatever is considered to have been the norm, we must be intolerant to. And then we must be tolerant to everything over here. Now, think about that. It's so black and white. There's no nuance. There's no critical thinking. There's no actual application of judgment here. It's just, if you have been part of what I decide is mainstream, we are intolerant. And then everything else, Everything else, despite what it is, despite how horrible it might be, despite how destructive or unfair or discriminatory it might be, if you are part of, or if not even you, but just if anything has been not the prevailing popular opinion or attitude, even if it's outlawed or suppressed, I mean, those were his words right there, we must be tolerant of that. We must be tolerant of that. And that is what they think. They think they are doing, I don't want to say God's work because they don't believe in God and they're definitely not doing God's work, but this is, in this religion, that's what they're trying to achieve. When they say they're the party of tolerance, they don't mean that they're actually the party of everyone together, holding hands, getting along, singing Kumbaya.
It's a small world after all. It's a small world after all.
It just means that they accept all of those people and practices and things that have been marginalized. Everything that has been oppressed, we now accept. That was communist, Marxist, Herbert Marcuse. The third achievement of Marcuse was he believed that the most promising revolutionaries would not come from the working class. Because remember, Marxism is bourgeoisie, proletariat, okay? Owners of the means of production, laborers, okay? And Marx believed that the laborers would be the one to bring about a revolution, to bring society to this socialistic practice. Marcuse believed that that wasn't the case, that it would actually be from those who are marginalized, this group over here, those on the margins of society. And more importantly, if they were marginalized based on characteristics that they can't change, they might be more eager to change society itself. So if you identify people who are on the fringe of society, not because of their wealth, right, or their class status, because in America, you could change your class status, you could increase your wealth, but if you do it on things like race and gender and things that you can't change, well, then that might motivate them to speed up the revolution to change society, because you can't change yourself, right? You can't change your race, you can't change your gender, or at least back in the 1940s, you couldn't. So we need to change society so that these people can be a part. In America, economic prosperity was not much of an issue. You could increase your wealth. It was so much not an issue that a Communist Party leader here from America actually went over to Moscow in 1929 and basically told Stalin that because of America's abundant resources, industrial capacity, and our lack of rigid class hierarchy, that she was not interested in revolution. Aww. That was 1929 during Stalin's reign, and the communists are seeing that America is not ripe for revolution because that class warfare was not taking hold. Because despite what you may think and have heard, you can increase your status in America. People have been doing it for decades and centuries, okay? We're not going to get into the details of that today, but America is an amazing place, okay? I'll just give you one example. My great-grandfather came here from Sicily. He was a fruit peddler in Sicily, okay? Poor. My grandfather in New York City did better than his father. My father did better than his father, and I and my siblings do better than our father. You can improve in America. It's a beautiful thing. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't be fooled. You can improve your wealth. So Marcuse and other Marxists realized that it wasn't going to be the laborers that brought about the revolution. It was going to be the people on the fringe of society. And more importantly, not just the fringe of society, but if they had those biological traits, right? You know, race, gender, ethnicity, things that couldn't be changed, they were the key to American Revolution. It shifted from economic Marxism to cultural Marxism. It shifted from the working class to minorities. Now we have the haves and the have-nots. We still have the haves and the have-nots, but instead of the haves having wealth, they have privilege, they have power. And that is all that matters. It doesn't matter if you are poor. It doesn't matter if you have been oppressed in some way. But if you are part of this group right here, they now have power. They have privilege, whereas this group does not. It also allowed this communism, this communist Marxist movement to kind of piggybacks on other movements. So there already were movements going on regarding these issues, right? Regarding race and gender. And it just allowed Marxism to jump on the bandwagon and kind of combine all of these together and identifying a common enemy. So communism went from combating capitalism strictly to now combating Western culture. So you're going to see all these movements that we're going to talk about where they all are basically combating Western culture. So now Marxists, instead of focusing on how everything in society is secretly a scheme to get you to spend money and make the capitalists rich, now they look at things in society that are secretly oppressive. For example, Valentine's Day is not just a day that corporations convince us to spend our money and make them rich, but Valentine's Day is actually, I'm going to quote this from, this is from everydayfeminism.com. I'm going to do my NPR voice when I read this because it's just so ridiculous, but this is how people think. This is what people are taught. This is becoming mainstream. Valentine's Day focuses on heterosexual, monogamous, romantic relationships. It also promotes the idea that romantic and sexual relationships should be something that everyone aspires to, an idea which marginalizes aromantic and asexual people. I don't even know what aromantic and asexual people are. I'm guessing it just means you're not monogamous, heterosexual, interested in those kinds of relationships. So yes, Valentine's Day is oppressive to the have-nots. It's worth noting that another founding member of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, left Germany and went to England in 1934, taught at Oxford, and then came to the United States, worked at Princeton and Berkeley. More than half a dozen of these men from the Frankfurt School came to the US. They settled mostly in universities, they settled mostly in New York City and LA. That's for the most part. Many of them in universities in their respective fields. There are a few who ended up working at State departments, particularly the precursor to the CIA. So that's really fun. That brings us to the radical 60s, where we start to see the implementation of critical theory come to life. Okay, so the Frankfurt School created critical theory. This is a definition. It is a social and political school of thought and philosophical perspective that analyzes and challenges systemic power relations in society, arguing that knowledge, truth, and social structures are fundamentally shaped by power dynamics between the dominant and the oppressed group. So we're going to look at everything in society and see how it really is this group oppressing, exercising power and dominion over this group over here. And that explains everything in society. It's not an exaggeration, okay? Every ill in society, every disadvantage, every poor choice that this group experiences is because of the power dynamic from this group. Not an exaggeration. We're going to look at it right here. So critical theory has evolved to critical social justice theory, which are the different applications of it. So first one, Black liberation theory. This came about during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So we're going to start seeing how these theories and this revolution, so to speak, piggybacks on other movements. The founder of this was a man named James Cone, who was a minister and a theologian. Black liberation theology combines the social gospel of Martin Luther King and the Black nationalism of Malcolm X. James Cone describes it as, he says it's an attempt to teach people how to be both unapologetically Black and Christian at the same time. Okay, you might ask, what is wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being Christian and being proud to be Black, especially back in the 1960s. Okay, that's fine. But James Cone also says that the overriding message of the Old Testament prophets and Jesus Christ is a condemnation of the nation and of the religious establishment for oppressing the poor. That's not quite right. That's not right at all. Yes, we take care of the poor and the oppressed. That's huge. That's a big part of what Christ did and what we're supposed to do as Christians, but that's not what the Old Testament is about. Remember, communism marries a truth to a lie. So the overriding message is that we need a savior who can change us and change societies and help us to bring us back to God. But you're starting to see the victim mentality framework taking shape. This is very similar to the liberation theology we talked about last episode that was very popular in South America at this time, particularly in the Catholic Church. James Cone himself, I couldn't find anything with him admitting to being a Marxist of any kind. However, he did reference Karl Marx several times in his writings. Also, if you recall, back when Barack Obama first came on the scene, there was some controversy that the right was pointing out regarding his pastor. His pastor was a man named Jeremiah Wright, who said things like, quote, "God bless America." No, not God bless America. God damn America. Okay, Jeremiah Wright he preached Black liberation theory. Okay, this is the fruit of that. And he was Barack Obama's pastor for 20 years. So, however, before James Cone, there was a man named Manning Johnson. So James Cone's 60s, Manning Johnson's 50s and 40s. He worked in the Communist Party. He was a leader in the Communist Party here in the United States. He actually ran for office in New York in 1935. He later left the Communist Party and became a staunch anti-communist government informant and witness. He wrote an entire book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense, which I first heard about this. I first heard about him and this book from President Benson. President Benson, and I don't know if it was I think it was a general conference address from the 60s where he mentioned Manning Johnson and this book. I'm going to read the preface so you get a good understanding of what he saw. It says, this explosive expose of the communist plan to use the Negro race, this was the 50s, okay? This was written in 1958. To use the Negro race to sow division, foment race wars, and ultimately bring about a socialistic totalitarian state was written by an American Negro communist. Again, don't hate me, this is the 50s, okay? Who defected from the party when he realized its cynical exploitation of Negroes was destroying the social fabric of Black communities and harming his own people. Manning Johnson, who died unexpectedly soon after his book was published, understood the risks of defecting from and denouncing communism, was an American hero. Manning himself writes, so this is Manning now, he said, 10 years I labored in the cause of communism. I was a dedicated comrade. All my talents and efforts were zealously used to bring about the triumph of communism in America and throughout the world. To me, the end of capitalism would mark the beginning of a period of peace, plenty, and prosperity, and universal comradeship. All racial and class differences and conflicts would end forever after the liquidation of the capitalist, their government, and their supporters. a world union of Soviet states under Russia would free and lead mankind onto utopia. I hate this ideology. This is what makes this ideology so gross, because it piggybacks on the real pain. It exploits and capitalizes real pain and real problems, okay? And it sells them a bill of goods that I have the answer and this is going to fix everything, right? This is Manning's own words. He thought if he ended capitalism, it would mark a period of plenty, peace, and prosperity. So he goes on to say, being an idealist, I was sold this bill of goods by a Negro graduate of the Lenin Institute in Moscow. So another Black man who was a communist, who had worked in Russia. The color of one's skin is no bar to a young man or woman dreaming of making a better world. Like other Negroes, I experienced and saw many injustices and inequities around me based upon color, not ability. I was told that the decadent capitalist system is responsible, that mass pressure could force concessions, but that just prolongs the life of capitalism. That I must instead work and unite all those who more or less agree that capitalism must go. Little did I realize until I was deeply enmeshed in the red conspiracy that just and seeming grievances are exploited to transform idealism into a cold, ruthless weapon against the capitalist system. That this is the end toward which all the communist efforts among Negroes are directed. It's despicable. It's despicable to sell people this bill of goods and you're lying to them. You're lying to them and they're just pawns in the chess game. That's what it was. He's speaking from 60 years ago. He saw this firsthand. It hasn't changed today. In the film by James Lindsay and Julie Beeling, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, which I've mentioned before, I definitely suggest you watch it. Regarding Black liberation theory, it was said that it turned people into revolutionaries who hate their country and want to divide their country and create chaos. That's the goal. Hate their country, divide their country, and create chaos. This gave way to critical race theory. Contrary to popular belief, critical race theory is not teaching racial history. No, that does not make me a white supremacist. And yes, I saw the meme. Yep, that meme right there. In case you're just listening, this is a meme that was making the rounds a few years ago. It's a picture of Ruby Bridges. So Ruby Bridges was one of 6 Black children in the South who were the first ones to desegregate white schools, and they had to be escorted. There was a lot of hysteria around this. People were yelling at them and spitting at them. She received lots of threats and just horrible. So the meme reads, the people who threw rocks at Ruby Bridges for trying to go to school in 1960 now are upset their grandchildren might learn about them throwing rocks at Ruby Bridges for trying to go to school. Okay, this was in response to the right's response to critical race theory. Okay, critical race theory had been something that had been pushed in schools, and this was when the right was saying, hey, this is not appropriate for, high school, especially elementary school. This was the left's response, okay? That's not what critical race theory is. It is not teaching history. I am all for teaching history. Every conservative I know is for teaching history. We are illiterate when it comes to history and civics, government in this country, okay? It is important that we teach history. I'm all for teaching history. Did you know that Abe Lincoln was the party of the anti-slavery movement, the Republicans? That's who they were. And that the first, few dozen Black members of Congress were Republicans. Did you know the Civil Rights Act was actually overwhelmingly voted no by Democrats, and that the longest filibuster on the books was actually done by Democrats to stall the Civil Rights Act. We want history. We want history taught. So critical race theory began in the 1970s in the legal field. It grew in the 80s and 90s and started to spread from there. It's the work of progressive legal scholars who were looking to basically look at the role of racism within the justice system. It challenges white privilege. So CRT is looking to examine specific experiences of oppression, not teach history. Journalist Don Pesci described it as just like Marx saw every social problem in the world from an economic class disparity, the critical race theorist sees race everywhere. It lies at the root of all social disorders. For example, in 2023, a black man, Tyree Nichols, was beat to death by 5 police officers. Okay, this was 2023, so this is well after BLM had just turned this country upside down. Did you hear about this? He died 3 days later. It's a sad, sad, sad thing. But the police officers were black. All 5 of them.
I'm about to educate some people right now. The vicious, brutal, unjustified extrajudicial killing of Tyree Nichols is as a result of a police system that is built on white supremacy. White supremacy underpins the policing and criminal justice system, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. It shapes a culture that sees black people as less, treats black lives as disposable, and ensures that black lives don't matter.
This was the actual statement from Black Lives Matter. Ready? They said, 5 police officers brutally beat Tyree to death. Although the media has spent a great amount of time drawing attention to the fact that the police officers are black, as if that is important. That's what they said. Let us be clear. All police represent the interest of capitalism and impel state-sanctioned violence. Anyone who works within a system that perpetuates state-sanctioned violence is complicit in upholding white supremacy. Assimilation into a system that is anti-black is one of the most dangerous weapons stemming from white supremacy. So it's just a bunch of word vomit blaming white people. If the officers had been white, well, white people would have been to blame as well. This is an actual lesson from a middle school in Maryland. This was found by the group Judicial Watch. It's a conservative group. So this is being taught to middle schoolers. Let's just take a second and look at this. There's the overt white supremacy that is socially unacceptable, but then there's a whole slew of covert white supremacy that is socially acceptable. Okay. So make America great again. Right there. That is your public tax dollars being used to teach your children that if their family members, if their friends, if anyone they know is a part of the Make America Great movement, then that is white supremacy. Not believing experiences of people of color, right? So if you didn't buy Jussie Smollett's, this is MAGA territory. Yeah, if you didn't buy that, then that means that you're racist. Assuming that good intentions are enough. The celebration of Columbus Day. We're going to have a whole episode on Columbus Day and how they have done him wrong and how it is every attack on Columbus is but once you learn this, you see it everywhere and you see the same tactics applied. So anyways, if you celebrate Columbus Day, well, then you're a white supremacist. Don't blame me. I never owned slaves. That makes you a racist. Bootstrap theory. I heard colleagues discuss how people, the right thinks that, poor people could just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, because what my colleagues believed was that poor people couldn't do that. You needed help. Help from who? Well, help from them. You needed help from whites. You need help from people who could pull you out. You have no ability to pull yourself out. And they weren't talking about people of color. They were just talking about poor people in general, but it disproportionately is people of color. And so pulling yourself up from that is not possible. You need a white savior. You need a bleeding heart liberal who can rescue you from your oppression. Okay. That's the mindset of these people. One of the founders of CRT was a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a lawyer, civil rights advocate, taught at UCLA and Columbia. She not only helped found CRT, but she also introduced and developed intersectionality. Now, if you don't follow politics, if you have not gone to school in the last 14 years, maybe, you maybe are not aware of this, but this is a real thing that is taught in classes and has now seeped into our culture and our politics. So intersectionality is overlapping victimization between race and gender. That's how it started. This is how far it's come. So here's a visual. This is intersectionality in Crenshaw's own words. It is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it lacks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. So when the right mocks the left by calling them, the oppression Olympics, it's a real thing. Everyone is just clamoring to figure out how they have been oppressed, how they are victimized. And we will go into the reasons why that's such a tempting thing for people to do at other episodes. But here's the list. If you're only listening, this is some of the things on the list: race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, mental health, age, education, body size, and many, many more. So now it's not just race, right? CRT focused on race, but Kimberly Crenshaw added all these other elements to it. So Crenshaw was very influenced. She credits and she cites a woman named Angela Davis for her work. So Angela Davis was a communist. She was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Not only that, but remember Herbert Marcuse, who came to American universities from the Frankfurt School? She was his doctoral student for a number of years, very close to Herbert Marcuse. And she, Marxist in her writings and her beliefs, she was a card-carrying communist. She, political activist, professor. You're starting to see a pattern here. So I just want to show this thread, though, between CRT. So CRT and intersectionality that shows that everyone has their unique experience of discrimination and privilege. So that was created by Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw credits Angela Davis as her inspiration. Angela Davis worked with Herbert Marcuse, communist from Europe. Herbert Marcuse studied the works of Antonio Gramsci and Karl Marx. Okay, that is the thread for CRT back to Karl Marx. So when we say it's Marxism, it is actually Marxism. I know that might hurt your brain and your heart because you want people to not suffer. You want things to be fair and equal. I get that. I really do. I know that has been the angle that the left has taken to persuade people that this is tolerant and compassionate and Christ-like. That's why so many religious people and Christians have just eaten this up. But I'm telling you, there is an underlying motive, and it's not actual compassion and equality. I promise. So critical race theory has started its march through the institutions and is doing quite well. There's all sorts of things you can find that are now white supremacists or examples of white supremacy. Here's just a few, just a quick search on the internet. This is what you can find. So examples of white supremacy include perfectionism, defensiveness only one way. So those ideas are examples of white supremacy according to the left. Math, that's an example of white supremacy. Punctuality, traffic signs, like the little white man on the black sign, people were saying that was an example of white supremacy, that this group that has all the power is trying to oppress this group. This leads us to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So DEI actually stemmed from affirmative action. So if you're not familiar with that, the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was going on, the government tried to increase opportunities for African Americans. And as civil rights kind of brought in, it started to include like Native Americans and women and other minorities. It basically was trying to help get them admitted into colleges, also receive jobs at state and federal agencies, things like that. So the equal employment laws led to more diverse workplaces, and those more diverse workplaces led to trainings to help people adjust and to create a more peaceful, harmonious workplace. Okay, that sounds fine. Absolutely. Okay, but just like the beneficiaries of affirmative action increased, the trainings have increased and expanded over time to not just workplace trainings, but you have jobs, like actual positions within corporations. You have entire departments at universities. There are majors that you can get to help you with becoming this and going into this field. As you saw in Matt Walsh's Am I a Racist? The whole premise of that documentary was Matt did an online training to become a DEI consultant and then used that training to go and teach people about their racism, which is what DEI is. Now, it sounds nice in theory, but in practice, what it's doing, DEI is simply reinforcing the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, that this group are the oppressors, this group are oppressed, and it doesn't change. If you recall from episode 3 where we talked about Asia, specifically Cambodia, when they were in these work camps, these young people were forced to attend lifestyle meetings every day. And they basically were taking turns criticizing each other and themselves. And the whole point was to create this division. It was to pit this group against that group, right? Or more appropriately, this. It was to pit this group and this group against one another. The whole point of these meetings was to foment strife and division and hate, and keep the people who were in power, the people who had power, and in this case, it was the city dwellers, in check and submissive, okay? And then the people who didn't have the power, and in that case, it was the rural farmers, to elevate them. Okay, this is a very Maoist communist approach to just divide people into classes and then to keep these people based on guilt and shame, to keep them in check and submissive, and to elevate this group so that they now have the power. I hope this is making sense. In episode 3, I showed a clip from Matt Walsh's movie, Am I a Racist?, that showed a very similar practice during a DEI seminar that Matt put on. I want to show another clip from the documentary. This is when Matt crashed something called Race to Dinner.
It's a race. It's a race. I'm winning. I'm winning.
I'll include a link to their website. This is a real thing. It's a real thing where women sign up to host a dinner and invite their friends, and they pay upwards of like $5,000. And then they invite these two ladies to come and have a discussion about race. This is what it looks like.
Let's be clear what's happening in this country. It's Nazism. Republicans are Nazis. You cannot separate yourselves from the bad white people. The entire system has to burn. And I'm not going to even use save this country. This country is not worth saving. This country is a piece of shit.
Oh, sorry.
This is what CRT has led to and what DEI creates. That takes us to feminist theory or feminism. Now, when I critique feminism, I'm specifically critiquing second wave feminism and beyond. Just to recap, there was first wave feminism, which is also known as the suffrage movement from the mid 1800s to about the 1920s. Their focus was right to vote, right to education, right to own property, right to be recognized legally as independent from their husbands. Second wave feminism, that's when it takes a real fun turn. That was in the 60s and 70s, and it challenged what women's role in society should be. Okay, you're starting to see this counterfeit rhetoric coming. Second wave feminism took a look at why women were oppressed, and it challenged traditional gender and family roles. And then third wave feminism came about in the 90s. Think vagina monologues. I didn't make it up.
Why don't you like me? Chapter 1, my first period.
The evolution of feminism has been interesting, as writer Kyle Smith puts it. He said it's startling to be reminded in the 2000s that as of the mid-60s, the feminist movement was centered on the concerns of typical middle-of-the-road women, married ones with children. How, he asks, did feminism come to be so closely associated instead with abortion, lesbianism, and a kind of neo-Marxist attempt to frame women as the new proletarian class, angry and destined to seize history's reins? That's a good question, Kyle.
It's a good question.
Second wave feminism is said to have been sparked by this woman, Betty Friedan. She specifically by a book that she wrote in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique, where she argued that life as a homemaker, wife, and mother, a stay-at-home mom, were unfulfilling roles. I'm going to read the introduction of the book in my NPR voice. Okay, get ready for this. Betty Friedan is often credited with starting the second wave feminist movement in the United States. She attended Smith College, where she majored in journalism, graduated in 1942, and married Carl Friedan 5 years later. Unfulfilled as a stay-at-home mother, Friedan questioned whether women could expect nothing more from life. She wrote to her fellow Smith classmates and asked them to fill out a survey that juxtaposed their education and career potential with their current satisfaction. She found a pattern in their answers. Quote, the problem that has no name. Wives and mothers quietly expressed dissatisfaction to Friedan, but did not know how to discuss their feelings beyond the questionnaire, because society told them the domestic role should make them happy. The Feminine Mystique shared these findings with the nation. Housewives read the book quietly in their kitchens after the dishes were done, the floor was mopped, and the laundry was folded. And a movement was born. Okay, a movement was born, but not a good one, okay? So, now I've read bits and pieces of The Feminine Mystique, just to let you know. I haven't read the whole thing, and it's a different kind of word vomit from what I've read. I'm going to give you some quotes just to give you an idea of what was in that book, because it is that book that it has said to have sparked second wave feminism, which got us to these abortion-loving, man-hating chicks you see today. And not even chicks. You got guys, who chop their nuts off and call themselves chicks. Whatever. Okay, here is some quotes from The Feminine Mystique. Fulfillment as a woman had only one definition for American women after 1949, the housewife mother. The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries. She was afraid to ask to herself, is this law. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how is this wrong? How is this bad? Right? You might have been feeling this. You understand why they might be feeling this. Remember, marries a truth to a lie. It's a counterfeit, right? Marxism is a counterfeit. Communism is a counterfeit. And we'll talk at later episodes why these women might have been feeling fulfilled. My big guess is spiritual fulfillment was the cause of that. But either way, we'll go on. This is quotes from the book. A woman today has no goal, no purpose, no ambition, patterning her days into the future, making her stretch and grow beyond that a small score of years in which her body can fill its biological function in committing a kind of suicide. For it is not the strength of the mothers that is at fault, but their weakness, their passive, childlike dependency and immaturity that is mistaken for femininity. Okay, she does not hold back any punches. Women who adjust as housewives, who grow up wanting to be just a housewife, are in much danger as the millions who walk to their own death in the concentration camps. This is right after World War II, after the Holocaust. So she is comparing, she uses the phrase comfortable concentration camps several times throughout the book to compare that to suburban housewives. A comfortable concentration camp. When she stopped conforming to the conventional picture of femininity, she finally began to enjoy being a woman. Okay, you might be cheering these on, and that's understandable. I used to think this way. This is the culture we've grown up in. I understand that. Okay. The book just goes on and basically explains how women have been bamboozled by magazines written by men, products that were created by men, right? And that's the gist of the book. Now, who was Betty Friedan? Well, her maiden name was Betty Goldstein, which is why people probably didn't know a whole lot about her until recently. She was a political activist. She was, in fact, friends, a Marxist. Yes, Betty Friedan was a Marxist. She was a political activist. She worked at Berkeley in the 40s and had several connections to different Marxists. Remember, a lot of the Frankfurt School members went to Berkeley. Okay. She became more politically active as time went on. She left Berkeley. She wrote for a radical left-wing, often described as communist paper for 10 years. So she wrote for a communist paper for 10 years. And then in 1963, when she was married with 3 children, she wrote The Feminine Mystique. A man named Daniel Horowitz has written a book about her, and he explains that beyond doubt, the woman who has always presented herself as the typical suburban housewife, right, that wrote this book about what that life was like, that she in fact was nothing of the kind. How many suburban housewives do you know who spent 10 years writing for left-wing publications? Okay, this was in the 40s and 50s. According to Friedan's ex-husband, who was also a radical leftist, okay, he complained that his wife, quote, was in the world during their whole marriage. He said that they had a full-time maid and that his wife was seldom a wife and a mother. So Horowitz concludes, and we can as well, that Friedan's writings were not motivated so much from her own experience as a wife and mother. Rather, it came from her Marxist hatred, her Marxist disdain of America, of Americans, of the American way of life. And I got to tell you, this movement, all these theories, all these movements just upset me, but this one might upset me the most. It might upset me the most. Reason being is the reason I'm here, just to give you a little background about myself, the reason I'm here has nothing to do, it didn't come from my love of country, it didn't come from my love of God or just interest or passion for politics or government. It didn't stem from that. What got me here, what started this road to get me here today talking to you about this, stemmed from my work with children. 18 years old, I got my first job working with kids and families, and I saw right away what the proclamation of the family had been talking about. Okay, I remember the proclamation of the family coming out. I remember reading it and being very underwhelmed by what was in there and thinking, oh, okay, that's nothing big. And then a few years later, I went to work with kids and their families, and I saw firsthand how a child's home life affects them, what it does to them. And I saw from 18 to now, I have seen almost every situation under the sun. I have seen extreme abuse and just horrific things done to kids, all the way to just neglect, just not caring, just spoiling, right? Helicopter parenting, everything in between. I've worked with socioeconomic groups all across the spectrum, and I have seen the same thing, that a child's home life, a child's upbringing determines, not always, there are some exceptions, but most likely will determine what they turn out as an adult. And this movement right here, this movement that was a lie, it was sparked on a lie from this woman who just wanted to, I guess, make a name for herself or just infuse her radical leftist beliefs and writings into the world. Okay. It started with this. The kids have been shortchanged. Kids are the ones who have suffered because of this. Okay. This started it. It took a lot more to get where we are today, and we're going to get into that. But kids have been put on the back burner. Kids have been neglected. And it has been this culture of moms don't really need to raise their kids. Moms don't really need to be home with their kids. Those kids don't need their mothers. What? Kids don't need that, right? And kids have been neglected. They have been screwed over. They have not received the childhood they deserve. We know that every soul is great in the sight of God, and it should be treated, he or she should be treated as such when they are brought into this world. But instead, we bring them into this world and they're not important. They're not a priority. They get shortchanged, and then they grow up as adults who do the same thing, and the cycle continues. That is what has gotten me here. I saw it firsthand, and then when I started to get into politics, I started to study policies and the effects on culture and the effects on families, and saw that there was a drastic change to where we have every 1 in 4 kids in America is raised without a father. And it starts here. It starts in the 60s. It starts with the countercultural culture, new left, feminist movements. Okay. The breakdown of the family is the result of this. And who is the one who suffers the most? It is children. It's not okay. I have seen it over and over again. And that is why this is probably my least favorite of all the movements. What it's done, it's sold a lie to women. I mean, women are a victim of this too. Sold them a lie. Men are a victim. Society is a victim, right? But it is kids who have been screwed the most from this, that they don't need their mothers. Okay, their mothers need to go find a life that is more fulfilling outside of the home. I used to think this way too. Don't worry. Okay, I understand this is what we've been taught, but it's a lie. It's not true. Children need their mothers. Babies need their mothers more than anything. This is the lie that stemmed it. It's worth noting a couple other feminist, second wave feminist leaders. Gloria Steinem, she emerged just right after Friedan emerged. She said, quote, "When I was in college, it was the McCarthy era, and that made me a Marxist." Okay. There's some speculation that she was a CIA operative. I don't know. She did serve on the Democrat Socialists of America as of 2016. An earlier second wave feminist icon was a woman named Simone Beauvoir. I saw a book on Simone Beauvoir in my library in the children's section. It was like one of those little tiny, I don't know if it was the golden books, but one of those tiny books about Simone Beauvoir. Well, let's talk about Simone Beauvoir, shall we? She identified early on as a communist and a socialist, later identified as a feminist. She was a firm advocate of abortion and contraceptives, anti-marriage. She had a longtime lover. They were both very influential French intellectuals. She's from France, by the way. So this is 20s, 30s, 40s time frame in France. Okay, whereas Frieden and Steinem are 60s America. She and her boyfriend, partner, lover, whatever you want to call him, signed a petition in France to advocate for the age of consent to be lowered. So at this time, it was already 15. Legal age of consent was 15 in France. They wanted it to be younger. And this petition came about as a result of 3 men who were arrested for having sex with 12 and 13-year-olds. So Beauvoir supported the men's right to have sex with 12 and 13-year-olds, okay? Her and her partner had multiple affairs, including with several teenagers. Beauvoir's affairs included both male and female, particularly female students that she taught. So these are the women who have shaped our culture, shaped our belief system for 60 years now. An angry Marxist radical who apparently had a maid, and a bisexual communist French woman who apparently liked to have sex with teenagers. Nice job. Nice job, guys. We've been fooled. We've all been fooled. Everyone, university students, suburban housewives, progressive Christians, right? We have just drank this up, just lapped it up. This is where it came from. That leads us to sexual theory, or the theory of sexuality, or the creation of sexologist. Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich was a member of the Frankfurt School. He was an Austrian doctor. He was mentored by Sigmund Freud, who I mentioned earlier. So Sigmund Freud was not communist, not Marxist. But this man, Wilhelm Reich, worked for him very, very closely. He was a communist. He joined the Austrian Communist Party 1928, then the German Communist Party in 1930, authored several books. He's one of the most radical figures in the history of psychiatry. And yes, he moved to America and taught at the New School in New York City. Like Freud, Reich focused on sexuality. Okay, this was just, his whole life was just sex. Okay, when he was a kid, when he was a kid, he watched his mom having sex with with his tutor at night, and apparently debated whether he should tell his dad or just force his mom to have sex with him. He ended up telling his dad, and his dad beat his mom to death. Nope, he beat her, and then she died. Eventually, she killed herself. Okay. I'm telling you this because this is the background of this man, which is incredibly sad and tragic. But this is the background of this man who has influenced generations since. He went on to have affairs with at least 2 patients and several marriages and several affairs. Okay, sex was his life. He's got a lot of issues, but his writings have influenced generations of intellectuals, and I want us to be aware of that. He is the one who coined the phrase sexual revolution. He is considered to be the father of the sexual revolution. He wrote that sexuality is the center around which all social life, as well as the inner life, revolves. Okay, remember, they just think we're dogs in heat, nothing more. But then we start to jump through some hoops and tie in the politics part. So he believed that true political revolution would only be possible after sexual repression was overthrown. Okay, so you're starting to see these Marxist ties, right? Because it's all about the power structure. It's all about creating a revolution, overturning the culture, capitalism, the West. Okay, and he thought that that was only possible if sexual repression was extinguished. He's been known as a sexual evangelist who believed that, there was ties between health and sickness and your sex life, that repressing one's sex drive created disorders. He was a proponent of infantile sexualization, which was developed by Freud. That, sexual urges of children in infancy and childhood are normal. And that infants and kids experience sexual pleasure from things like breastfeeding from their moms or sucking their thumbs. Yeah, this is real. And then they tie the sexual oppression to the economic oppression. Okay, so Reich saw traditional family structures as the societal norm. So remember, you have the haves, the have-nots, the accepted aspects of society. So traditional family structures go in that category. And he saw that it was oppressive and that it restrict a healthy sexual development, leading to societal issues like fascism. Naturally.
Well done! Colin's going over! Everyone's exhausted! Sonia, well done!
He said, quote, "The patriarchal laws that govern culture, religion, and marriage are in their essence directed against sexuality." That takes us to the sexual revolution. Okay, remember, by their fruits shall you know them. So this is the fruits of Reich. That is the sexual revolution. Also known as sexual liberation. It was a movement that challenged traditional codes of behavior relating sexuality and relationships in the 60s and 70s. It increased acceptance of intercourse outside of heterosexual monogamous relationships, mainly marriage. Reich's ideas were supported by Herbert Marcuse. Remember, he was a fellow Frankfurt School member, came to the US, worked for the CIA, taught in universities. Marcuse said in 1955 that a couple's desire to marry and raise children, guess what that was? It was an expression of sexual repression. Are you starting to see the Antichrist teachings in this? Are you starting to see how it starts to take shape, where it's really just anything having to do with the family and religion, specifically Christianity? That's what this is. Okay. So there were other intellectuals that fueled the sexual revolution, not just Reich or Marcuse, but a man named Alfred Kinsey and Sigmund Freud, who were not Marxists. Okay. But just, you see this formation of the new left, where it's just counterculture. I'm having a hard time saying that word. Counterculture. So just anything that is mainstream part of the culture, they're going to do the opposite. Okay. There were other parts of the sexual revolution, not just, acceptance of sex outside of marriage. It led to acceptance of porn, public nudity, homosexuality, masturbation, abortion, right? Those are all things that came afterwards. That's what was sold. But in reality, what this was suggesting and teaching these young people is that you can separate sex from marriage. You can separate sex from love, emotion, family, kids, commitment, responsibility, really anything that once was the marker for a successful, healthy, well-established adult. It can be separated from those things, and you can just have the pleasure aspect of it. Not the responsibility, not the commitment, not any of the boring stuff, none of the traditional parts, just the pleasure. That's all it was about. So this Marxist doctrine not only separated those things, but it also encouraged it, and encouraged that the things that was separating from, so the all the traditional aspects of sex, right? Those things were oppressive. They were oppressive, and if you wanted to live freely, you had to get rid of those. It was these things that was holding people back from being free, from realizing their full potential. It's very, very, that's an antichrist teaching right there. And taught that those things were also bad. Okay, so here's sex, here's everything that it was once tied to that made not just individuals successful, but society successful, that made families strong and cohesive, which then made communities strong and cohesive, which then made society and culture and one's policies and government, all of those things that were strong and cohesive entities, institutions, it separated it. Okay, this is what I was talking about with feminism. This is the time period where family, the nuclear family, was disintegrating. It was attacked. And this was one of the methods, a Marxist method. I had a colleague once who I loved. She was one of my favorite people, total, just heart of gold, total old hippie. Okay. Just, I mean, Middle Ages technically, but just an old hippie who I just love to tease. And I was teasing her once about this time period, about the hippie days, the party days, the crazy 60s, because my parents lived through that time period and they enjoyed it quite thoroughly. And she, I start to tease her and her eyes just light up. She gets this big smile on her face. She kind of leans back in her chair and she just says, "Oh, those were the best. Those were the days." And I just laughed and teased her and moved on. But later that day, as I was driving home, I was thinking about this and I thought, those weren't the days. Those weren't the best days, because while they may have been fun, I'm sure they were fun for you and everyone else. My generation has grown up with the consequences of those days. I grew up in the 90s where everyone knew someone whose parents were divorced. The older I got, the more and more kids had parents who were divorced. Soon I was working with kids and families in a professional capacity, and it was almost like half and half, kids who were in a home with mom and dad and kids that weren't. It was very common to see families with multiple kids with multiple last names from different dads, all sorts of issues, behavioral issues with these children, all sorts of things. I mean, 1 in 4 kids today are raised in a home without a father. It started here, not just with the sexual revolution. Not just with the sexual revolution per se and separating sex from all responsibility and all commitment. That was a huge, huge part of it. But this time period also saw the push for abortion. It saw the invention of birth control, the creation of no-fault divorce, the welfare program, all of which contributed to the breakdown of the nuclear family. And who does that affect? Who are the victims of this breakdown? Kids. Kids get shortchanged what they deserve. The Proclamation of the Family says that children are entitled to be raised by a mother and father. Why? Because every soul is great in the sight of God. Why wouldn't they be entitled to all the gifts and things that a man brings and a woman brings? Not just a man and a woman, but their mother and father, who ideally conceive them in love and are committed to one another just as they're committed to that child. Now, the sexual revolution had lots of consequences. One that I want to point out is the formation of the North American Man-Boy Love Association, called NAMBLA, 1978. Yes, you heard that correctly. It is just what it says. It's an association that pushes for the normalization of man-boy love. They advocated for lowering age of consent laws, all sorts of fun things. So that was 1978. It was started. Apparently, from what I could research, they stopped holding meetings in the 90s, the late 90s. But as of 2005, it's reported that they were still based out of San Francisco and New York. So thank you, Sexual Revolution, for that. Sexology was the precursor to gender theory. Gender theory is the study of how gender is socially constructed, not biological, right? So sex is what you're born, how you're born, but gender is how you feel, right? And that is that was determined by social factors. It emerged in the 80s and became its own academic field by the end of the 20th century. Gender theory recognizes that social expectations, roles, and behaviors are socially created and challenge the assumption that gender identity is linked to biological sex. Okay, if you're following what's been going on in the world in the last 5, 10, 15 years, this is something that you have heard. The man credited with sexology is John Money. John Money, okay, he was from New Zealand originally. He's a psychologist, sexologist, and professor. Very, very popular in the 70s and 80s. He was the world's leading sexologist, distinguished and honored for his research on human sexual behavior and gender. He was not a Marxist. Just want to point this out. He was not a Marxist, but he was a sexologist, which is the same vein as Wilhelm Reich, okay, who was a Marxist and communist. Also, John Money was a social constructivist. And this is a theory that was developed by a Marxist in the Soviet Union, psychologist Lev Vygotsky. And we're not going to get into Lev Vygotsky, but you see those ties. Okay, so you have Wilhelm Reich, you have Lev Vygotsky, both are communist Marxists, and then you have John Money. Okay, that this is the fruit of those theories. And social constructivism is simply put nature versus nurture, where nurture wins out, and that the nurture, right, how someone was raised, is determined by that individual's relationship to the means of production. And this shapes their character, their biology, their genetic makeup. I know, it's just more of the word vomit, okay? Now, you can substitute means of production, which is that's a communist Marxist original term, and you can substitute it for power. That's how it has evolved in the last century. So an individual's relationship to power, or the class of people who hold the power, shapes who they are. This is something still claimed by transgender theorists today. So what is the social constructionist view on sexuality? Well, sexuality is a social construct rather than something biological. It's not fixed, it's molded by the conditions that we live in, including the norms and expectations that are enforced by the people of power, the ruling class, okay? They believe that gender is deeply influenced by the capitalist system. I know this makes your head hurt and you're like, oh my gosh, this is insane, but this is what people believe. This is what they're learning. This is what they're learning at university. So if you have a child who is at college or going to be at college soon, they will be hearing this. And it is important that we understand where it's coming from. Okay. So gender itself is a social construct influenced by capitalism, and it creates these gender roles that can, here's their favorite word, oppress. Oppress who? Well, transgender individuals, okay? Why? Because if you're transgender, your gender doesn't match with your sex, okay? So your gender is expressed differently than your biological sex, and that's bad because society has basically created a world where you are not allowed to live and express your gender freely, your identity freely. And it forces people, children, babies, to conform to these societal expectations based on their assigned sex at birth. You have to pay attention to this stuff and take it seriously. I remember it was 2013. I was at lunch with some of my husband's friends, and one of his friend's girlfriends was talking. We were talking about politics. We're all very conservative. And she mentioned a New York Times article that she read that said that, I don't know who they was, if it was doctors, it was probably people in academia who suggest, the experts, okay? The experts were suggesting that parents don't assign their child a gender, that they let their babies, their children, decide on their gender. And we all laughed at that. And this was 2013. This was before Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner. This is when trans were just transvestites, right? They were just guys who liked to wear dresses. It's weird. You saw them occasionally, you kind of just kept to themselves. And there's drag queens, but whatever. 2013. Look how far that has come in this short amount of time. As I talked about in episode 1, you can't just turn a blind eye to this. You can't just think that all is well in Zion, because I don't want to think about all this other stuff. It's here. It's in our world. It's the world that we are raising our kids in. Here's a quote from an online publication called medium.com. If you're ready, get ready for some word vomit and hoop jumping right here. Okay. Quote, the rigid, here's my NPR voice again. It just begs for that. Hold on. The rigid gender binary within capitalism serves to maintain power dynamics with the expectation of men as the primary breadwinners and women relegated to domestic roles, further marginalizing transgender individuals who do not conform to these expectations. Okay, well, back to John Money. So John Money bought into this and he expanded it. So in 1955, he is known to be the one to first use the term gender. He coined the terms gender role, sexual orientation. He helped establish a new field of research in sexual science. He coined the term chronophilia and nepophilia. So basically characterize what we just think pedophilia, right? Like someone who is attracted to kids. And he broke it down into different levels, right? Are you attracted to teenagers, preteens, all the way down to infants and babies? Okay. So he wasn't known to be doing that stuff, but he's categorizing it. Okay. In 1983, he stated in a case study publication that that pedophilia could be characterized as combining devotion, affection, and infatuation, camaraderie with a touch of hero worship, and ultimately is harmless in most instances. Okay, so when I said he's not doing this stuff, he's making the case to defend the stuff. He stated that both sexual researchers and the public do not make distinctions between affectional pedophilia and sadistic pedophilia. Okay. He is allegedly to have said to a now defunct Dutch journal, quote, if I were to see the case of a boy aged 10 or 12 who's intensely attracted towards a man in his 20s or 30s, if the relationship is totally mutual, then I would not call it pathological in any way. Okay, so you're starting to see how things are just going downhill real fast. So this is why he's famous. If you're up to speed on your conservative info, you've probably heard of him. He was the first medical professional to recommend and carry out gender assignment surgery or therapy for a baby, specifically a toddler. 1966, David Reimer had a botched circumcision and resulted in his penis being mangled. His parents, in desperation, and your heart just kind of goes out to them, right? Sought out Dr. Money after hearing about what his work was, and they had his genitalia surgically removed. He was given a vagina and renamed Brenda and placed on hormone therapy while he's 22 months old. Oh no, 22 months old. Sorry, 22 months old is when they reached out to Dr. Money. Okay. He continued to see John Money regularly for years. Now, allegedly, this boy, David, and his twin brother, Brian. So David is now going by Brenda as a girl and living life as a girl, and he has a twin, Brian. John Money would see both of these boys throughout the years, and they allegedly coerced the brothers to perform sexual acts on each other that Money photographed. Reimer reported that money would get angry if they didn't do as they were told. David sadly lived a very troubled life, ending his life in suicide at the age of 38, just 2 years after his brother did. So, in addition to this tragedy, David actually, who was raised as early as he could remember to be a girl, began identifying as a boy at age 14. So the surgery, the hormones, the social transition didn't work. And it has had a lasting scarring effect on him, sadly. Now, in researching this, you would think that this evidence points to the fact that transgenderism, socially, medically transitioning kids doesn't work. Sadly, the indoctrination runs deep. Okay, the hoops just keep going in the head. I've seen people passionately argue that this is actually making the case for transgenderism, that David really, biologically was a boy and socially identified as a boy, and he wasn't allowed to live this way because he was forced to live as a girl. So it actually proves that when people aren't allowed to express their identity, their gender identity, that it is detrimental to their health. And then there's those of us who live in reality who are like, no, this kid was screwed up. He knew something was off and figured it out, and thankfully was able to continue to live as a boy, by the time he was a teenager, but it left lasting scars. So this calls back to last episode 4, where we talked about the whistleblowers, to Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, and how he said that this propaganda war is so effective. It's so effective that people are so brainwashed that even when you present them with facts, this is something he said, I'm paraphrasing, when you present people with facts and information, they're not going to believe it. They don't want to believe it. This is an example of that. And if they don't want to believe that, they definitely don't want to hear this. This is queer theory. Okay, guys, we're doing good. We're almost done. Queer theory is a critical theory that examines how society defines and polices gender and sexuality, and how social and power structures shape them. Okay. Basically deconstructing what is considered normal and acceptable, and to challenge traditional assumptions about gender and sexual identities. Okay. It is to challenge traditional assumptions about gender and sexual identities. Notice that there was no mention of gays or lesbians in there. Okay. When you hear queer theory, you probably think gay theory, right? Oh, that's not what it is. It's based on the idea that gender and sexual identities are social constructs, not biological, and sexuality is fluid. Okay, that's stuff we've been hearing. The term queer was first used informally in the 80s by different scholars. One is Gloria Anzaldúa. She is an American writer and cultural theorist. She once depicted herself, quote, as a third world lesbian feminist with Marxist and mystic leanings. Okay. But queer theory started long before that. That brings us to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher, author, activist, teacher. He is considered one of the most controversial scholars of the 20th century. Also a former communist and Marxist. He joined the French Communist Party in 1950. However, he left a few years later after experiencing homophobia and anti-Semitism. He started to evolve away from Marxism, and actually became a strong critic of Marxism, but not for what you may be thinking. Not because he thought it was bad. He just thought that Marx's view was too narrow. He wrote several books in the 70s and the 80s, was a lecturer at Berkeley. He was one of the intellectuals that signed that petition in France. Remember Simone de Beauvoir and her partner signed that would lower the the age of consent to 13. A friend of Michael Foucault accused him of being a pedophile rapist. He said that Foucault would travel to Tanzania in the 60s and would abuse young boys while he was there. Okay. James Lindsay, who I've mentioned before, talks at length about queer theory. I'll include the link below. I encourage you to listen to what he has to say about this. So, Foucault's work has significantly inspired several other queer theorists. Judith Butler. Judith Butler is alive today. She's somewhat of a left-wing celebrity of sorts. She feminist, gender studies, just queer theory, all of that. Okay, that's what she does. She's in the field of academics. As early as the 90s, Judith Butler was using drag as an example of gender performativity to destabilize gender norms and made the case that drag queens are the leading voice of the sexual revolution. Okay, that was the 1990s. So drag queens are not just drag shows and drag queens. It's not just something to, expose people to for some lighthearted entertainment, to just normalize these people, normalize this lifestyle. No, what queer theory is arguing is that drag queens and drag shows are the latest tool to fight oppression. Drag queens are leading the call to fight against the power, the systemic oppression, the haves, anything that is considered normal, right? They are leading the fight against it. So the sexual revolution that started in the 1960s by a Marxist is still going strong today through drag. And Foucault also inspired the work of a man named David Halpernin. David Halpernin was a gender studies, queer theorist, critical theory, right? All these things in the 90s. That's when he was very, very popular. He wrote a book called Saint Foucault. So this is how much he was inspired by Foucault. Halpernin further defined and explained queer theory. The term queer and queer theory gets its definition from this book, Saint Foucault. Okay, this is from that book. Now, this is important because remember, when you hear queer or queer theory, your mind goes, it's homosexual theory, right? Halpernin explains that unlike gay identity, queer means adopting a politics that is whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant. Unlike gay identity, queer theory means adopting a politics that is whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. That possibly can't go anywhere bad, right? Nothing bad can come from that. To underscore this point, he continues, queer is not restricted to lesbian and gays. It is in fact available to anyone who is or feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices. So queer is for anyone who feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices. Do we not see where this is going? Have you noticed the right is the only one who points this out, that the drag queen story hour, it's only story hour at schools or libraries with kids. I don't see drag queen story hour at nursing homes. I don't see it at military installations. You don't see that. The focus is kids. That leads us to a woman named Gail Rubin, who was active in the 90s, queer theorist, feminist, all activists, all these things. She's not a Marxist. She is one who also thought that Marxist views were too narrow, right? So if people say, no, the left isn't Marxist, they took Marx's views and they've expanded upon them, okay? She was a leading voice of queer theory since the 80s. I just want to show you this or tell you this because this is what we're up against. So in 1984, this woman who was very prominent in her community wrote that boy lovers were victims of savage and undeserved witch hunts. Okay. Boy lovers were victims of savage and undeserved witch hunts. I have heard not one but two TED Talks in recent years where they explain that pedophilia is a sexual orientation that people are born with, that they cannot change, and that we should not shame people because they have no control over it. Do you not see where this is going? There's a book that was just released in 2022 from the University of California. It is called A Long Dark Shadow, Minor Attracted People and Their Pursuit of Dignity. If you haven't heard, pedophilia is offensive, and minor attracted persons, or MAPs, that is the politically correct term for these individuals. Okay? Lest you think I'm being dramatic or exaggerating, here is a post I came across on X from user at consuela@mapsupport.de. I don't know what the DE means, but in case you're just listening, it shows various rainbow flags and it says this: think before you speak hate, you big fat bigots. Okay, it doesn't say that. It says, think before you speak hate. Someone you know is gay, someone you know is bi, someone you know is transgender, and someone you know is MAP. Maybe even someone you love. Think before you speak hate. There was another one that this account put out, just to add some fun to it. It says, someone you know is gay, someone you know is transgender, someone you know is zoo.
I am shocked. Shocked. Well, not that shocked.
Zoo. Maybe even someone you love. Okay, I'm going to let you figure out what zoo means. They're not hiding it. They're not hiding it. And just FYI, I looked up this username and I found one other thing on the internet about it. I can't trace it to an actual person, but I'll put that below as well so you can do some investigating yourself. Oh, so we're seeing this push that these people are victims, right? They're oppressed. They can't control who they are, or they're just trying to live their best identity. And it is the heteronormative, the people of power, the haves, the oppressors who are the bad guys, not them. Whew, that was a doozy. Not gonna lie, that took me 2 days to film and my voice is totally gone. So I want to finish up with a couple more things and then we will close with our go and do challenge and happy thought. Okay, so just stick with me. You don't want to miss this. So this is a video from Yuri Alexandrovich Beznamov. If you recall last episode, I showed a clip from a very long YouTube video that he did in the 80s where he breaks this down. And he mentions, well, I'll let you see what he says.
Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
So how did we get from the radical 60s to today? Well, those radical young people grew up and they went into the medical field. They went into public policy. They went into education. They went into business. They have infiltrated all aspects of society, and they're pushing their worldview that they think is what is best for society and best for America. Journalist David Volodosco summarizes this Marxist cultural movement here in America with this statement. Ready? He says, "Sadly, we did this to ourselves. We have told our children for generations that America is racist, sexist, colonial, and genocidal empire. We have used Marxist critical theory to deconstruct everything from the Revolutionary War to Mickey Mouse. We have been told our national anthem is racist, our national flag is racist, the bald eagle is racist, even the term American is racist. We have been teaching our children to hate their own country for decades, and they've finally gotten the message. As they say, you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And the new left is not only emotional, but hysterical. Worse, it's cultural. This is why Yuri Bezmenov said the first stage takes a generation. They had to build an entire cultural ecosystem, and they did this using our schools, news outlets, and film studios. They are now so thoroughly demoralized from American culture, they've become nihilistic. We may very well need another 40 years to take this all apart." I'm hoping this made sense. I hope you have been able to see the ties, the thread from Karl Marx and John Lennon and Mao Zedong, right? Just hardcore communists and Marxists, and how it has infiltrated our society. Once you understand this, once you see this, you can't unsee it, and you see it everywhere. It's so pervasive in our American culture today. I hope it helps you. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that we are in this communist takeover per se, that it is very much cultural. But there's a lot of unknowns, right? There's a lot of knowns and a lot of unknowns. Here's some things that I do know. A former top aide to New York Governor Kathy Hochul was arrested and accused of being a secret agent for the Chinese government. Representative Eric Swalwell, who's a Democrat from California, was allegedly having an affair with a Chinese spy. In 2023, FBI director warned that the number of Russian spies operating in the U.S. is still way too big, despite the efforts to kick them out. We know that TikTok has ties to the CCP. So that's the espionage part of this. We know that America is enemy number one for many nations who want to become the top nations. Many nations want to see us fall. I didn't realize this growing up. I didn't have to think about this growing up. We lived very modern, cushy lifestyles, and we didn't have to worry about someone coming into our borders and destroying us, right? But it's very real. People want to see America fall. On the home front, I do believe what Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov has said about these radicals from the 60s, and that they continued to influence American culture. We know that the founders of Black Lives Matter were, in their own word, trained Marxists. We know that the mayor of LA, Karen Bass, she made waves because she was the mayor when they had the huge fires, and they handled it horribly. She has ties to a Marxist organization in Cuba. There's a man in San Francisco. He's a very, very wealthy attorney by the name Stephen Phillips. He's a self-identified Marx, Mao, and student. He's a self-identified student of Marx, Mao, and Lenin. He is a huge Democrat donor. He was instrumental in getting Barack Obama elected, as well as Kamala Harris. We know we have globalists like Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates who are promoting ideas that defy what our Constitution has stated, defies what America, the beliefs and ideals that America was founded on. I don't claim to know everything. There's a lot I don't know. There's a lot I'm still learning. However, what I have learned is quite frightening. And we need to act. All of us need to act starting today. Now, what can we do when we feel frightened and there are things that are just completely out of our control? Well, we focus on our sphere of control. And today, my go and do challenge to you is it's small. You and I are not going to change the world today or tomorrow, but we can change our families. We can prepare our children for the world that they are going to be facing soon. My challenge to you is to just pick one thing within your home life, your family life, just one thing right now that can increase the spirit in your home, that can make it more of a sanctuary from the world. Something that you can add to your home or something that you can take out of your home or your family life to increase the spirit in your home. We can all do that today. We can start to empower our families within our homes. So, what is my edifying thought? What's my happy thought to leave with you? Well, it's simple. It's this. It's the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was written for our day, for all aspects of our day, okay? The spiritual, the familial, the cultural, and the political. All right here. President and prophet Ezra Taft Benson, who was also a staunch anti-communist, taught this. He said, the Nephites never had the book. Neither did the Lamanites of ancient times. It was meant for us. Mormon wrote near the end of the Nephite civilization, under the inspiration of God, who sees all things from the beginning. He abridged centuries of records, choosing the stories, speeches, and events that would be most helpful to us. Each of the major writers of the Book of Mormon testified that he wrote for future generations. If they saw our day and chose those things which would be of greatest worth to us, is not that how we should study the Book of Mormon? We should constantly ask ourselves, why did the Lord inspire Mormon or Moroni or Alma to include that in his record? What lesson can I learn from that to help me live in this day and age? Why did the authors of the Book of Mormon include that? Why did the Lord inspire them to keep it? What can I learn that can help me live in this day and age? Because they saw this day and age, and that's how they compiled it. God did not leave us during the most difficult and destructive and demonic time period in the history of the world. He did not leave us here in these last days to struggle, to flounder, to be on our own. He's given us tools, many tools. The Book of Mormon is one of them. Take comfort in knowing we have it. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. I hope to see you next time.